When I was younger, I used to engage in hitchhiking, a practice I now find hard to believe I actually did. Looking back, I realize how extremely dangerous it was, and it's not as common anymore. Back in the 90s, when I didn't have a cell phone and they weren't as popular as they are now, I would hitchhike for certain parts of my travels, especially when I was broke and trying to find work in another state. One particular evening, I found myself in a town late at night after missing a bus that passed through. Although it wasn't a large city, it had a few stores, restaurants, and other amenities. The city I was aiming to reach was just about an hour away. Since I couldn't afford to hitchhike the entire way, I decided to try my luck for the final leg of the journey. Standing on the side of the road, I waited for a while as cars passed by. It was already around 10 p.m., and the roads were less busy. Eventually, a pickup truck slowed down and came to a stop in front of me. I approached the passenger side window, where I saw an average-looking guy named Terry. After a brief conversation, he agreed to give me a ride to the city I was heading to, as he was going there as well. Feeling confident and without any suspicions, I got into the truck. As we drove, Terry remained quiet, and I was so tired that I ended up dozing off, resting my head against the window and the headrest. When I woke up, I felt disoriented. I was still in the truck with Terry, who was focused on the road. However, something felt off. We were driving on a quiet road instead of taking the freeway, which would have been the direct route to my destination. Confused, I asked Terry why we were on this road, but he didn't answer. Time seemed to have passed, and we should have reached the city by now. I glanced at the clock in the car, and it had been over an hour since I fell asleep. The situation became even more unsettling when I realized there were no detour signs or any indication of a legitimate reason for us to be on this isolated road. When I inquired about how far we were, Terry vaguely replied that we were close and would get there soon. My unease grew as Terry continued driving, and he eventually turned onto another road, where I caught a glimpse of a small sign that said, "Dead End." Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out of that truck. Despite the manual lock being engaged, I managed to unlock the door and swiftly jumped out. I fell but quickly regained my footing. I ran as fast as I could, veering off the road and through grassy areas, possibly trespassing in someone's backyard. I could hear the sound of the truck in the distance, but luckily, Terry didn't chase after me. Finding temporary refuge behind a tree, I hid until I felt it was safe to move again. After some time, I cautiously left my hiding spot and made my way back to the road. Eventually, I stumbled upon a random person's house and mustered the courage to knock on their front door. To my relief, they answered, and I asked for directions to the nearest gas station. They informed me it was about a mile away, and I managed to reach it on foot. From there, I discovered my precise location, a nearby suburb, several miles away from the city I initially intended to reach. It became clear that Terry had driven me past my destination, likely intending to take me to his own house. Thankfully, I made it to where I needed to be, but that incident made. I've noticed a few arcades nowadays, but they are nowhere near as abundant as they were when I was growing up. The arcades today are very different, of course. The games are much more advanced, but that's not the only thing. Maybe I'm just getting old, I don't know. But there's something about those old 80s-style arcades that fills me with a wonderful sense of nostalgia. I remember when standing around, watching others play Pac-Man was a big deal. I never thought we would reach a time where any video game would be bigger than Pac-Man. But now, he's pretty much just an afterthought. One of the better things about the arcades today is that they tend to be in better parts of town and nicer buildings. The few I see are at least in places like GameWorks, in areas that seem to have very low crime and are kept clean and well maintained. In the late 70s and early 80s, arcades were looked down upon by most people. Before Pac-Man was released, kids didn't really hang out at arcades. They attracted an older group, with lots of smoking, drinking, and some dark stuff going on. Most people credit Pac-Man with being the game that brought children in, but even after Pac-Man, they didn't automatically become the nicest and safest places to be. I mention Pac-Man a lot because it has some relevance to my story. The game, Pac-Land, came out around 1984, and I was obsessed with wanting to play it. It basically involved Pac-Man walking to the end of town, grabbing these magic boots, and then running back to the beginning of the board. It was one of the earliest side-scrolling games. The only problem was that in the arcade I went to, I never really got a chance to play. I was 11 years old at the time, and that game always had a line of people waiting for it. An 11-year-old would never be able to get to the front of the line. My big break came when Gauntlet was released in 1985. That game became the big video game of that arcade, freeing up most of the other machines. I was 12 at this time, and I often headed down to the arcade on weekends by myself. My parents didn't really care, they didn't take any interest in what I did. The arcade I would go to was in a crappy part of town, right next to a 7-Eleven that had a pretty bad reputation as a gang hangout. The building itself was very dirty and always loud due to the combination of noise from the games and the extremely loud rock music they played. On this particular day, when I got to the arcade, I noticed a large number of people hanging out by the Gauntlet machine. There were other people scattered throughout, but not many. Gauntlet was a bit revolutionary for the time since 4 people could play simultaneously. I became very excited because my expectations were that I would finally be able to play Pac-Land. I went to the part of the arcade where the game was and was astounded to find it being played by only one person, an older teenager. This didn't come as a surprise to me, though. The arcade had a rule that if you wanted to play a game after someone, you could place a quarter on the game to save it for your turn. Excitedly, I ran up, took out my quarter, and put it down on the game. The guy playing it, momentarily distracted, turned and gave me a dirty look. I didn't really care because I was finally going to.